Every spring between 1843 and 1847, when the first heat began to rise off the Alabama clay and the magnolia blossoms clung to the air like perfume over a grave, Blackwood Plantation carried the same quiet dread. The land stretched wide beneath a swollen sun, rows of cotton reaching out in every direction, the fields moving with the wind like pale water. The house stood at the center of it all, a monument to one man's pride, built on the backs and bones of others who had no claim to their own breath. From a distance, Blackwood appeared stately, serene, touched by prosperity. Only those who lived beneath its roof knew that nothing about that place had ever been peaceful. The plantation thrived under a planter who measured his worth by how much fear he could harvest. His voice carried farther than the chapel bell, and his presence reached into every corner of the house and grounds. Servants and slaves learned to walk lightly, to breathe softly, to lower their eyes even when he was nowhere in sight. The walls themselves seemed to tense when he entered a room. His shadow governed the house as completely as his hand governed the fields. And no season ever passed without something breaking beneath him, spirit, bone, or will. His wife drifted through those years like an apparition, corseted and silent, her face powdered into a mask that hid nothing from those who knew how to look. There was a time before Blackwood when she had laughed easily and dreamed freely. But the plantation consumed softness the way a fire consumes paper. She learned to speak less, to feel less, to fold her grief inward until it became part of her spine. The house expected her to be ornamental, obedient, and empty. Over time, emptiness became the closest thing to safety she could find. Spring was the worst. It was the season of preparation, of labor multiplied, of demands that never ceased. The planter rode the fields with his boots polished and his temper sharpened, pushing work past exhaustion until even the earth seemed to ache. The enslaved bent their backs in the sun from the first light to the last, and still he was never satisfied. He hunted for weakness, for hesitation, for anything he could punish to remind them that mercy would never be found in his shadow. Among those who toiled in his fields was a man smaller in stature than the rest, born with a body that the world mocked and dismissed. The planter took pleasure in that difference. To him, the man was not fully human, only a spectacle to be overworked and underestimated. Yet beneath that short frame lived a mind that saw everything. He endured what others might not have survived, absorbing humiliation with eyes that never lost their clarity or their quiet, burning understanding. He learned patience the way others learn prayer, one breath at a time. Their lives, wife and slave, crossed only through the cruelty of the man who ruled them both. She saw the planter's contempt for the enslaved man, and in that cruelty she recognized echoes of her own captivity. Though her chains were gilded and his were iron, both were bound to the same master. The knowledge unsettled her at first, a truth too raw to accept. Over time it became the only truth she trusted. The house looked grand from the road, but rot lived behind its polished wood and silver trimmings. Neighbors spoke politely of dinner parties and fine china, never daring to acknowledge the bruises that silence could not hide, or the way servants flinched when footsteps fell too hard on the floorboards. Everyone saw. No one intervened. Wealth blinded some, fear silenced others, and the rest simply chose ignorance over discomfort. Blackwood became a place where cruelty was a private currency, traded behind closed doors. The wife learned to move through her days without allowing herself to feel their shape. She embroidered, she poured tea, she pressed flowers between pages of books she no longer read. At night, she closed her eyes and pretended her body was not her own. She became skilled at vanishing inward, slipping behind a wall in her mind while the world continued outside of it. Each time she returned to herself, she found a little less of who she had once been. The enslaved man had no such refuge. His body was his cage, And every task, every command, every punishment reminded him of it. Yet something in him refused to break. He watched, he waited. He memorized the moods of the house, the weaknesses of its master, the quiet tremors in the foundation of a life built on terror. The planter saw him as less than a man, but the enslaved man understood this with perfect clarity. Under tyranny, patience becomes a weapon. Years on that plantation blurred together, marked only by harvests and wounds. Yet the land remembered everything. The soil held memory like blood holds stain. With each passing spring, the weight of what Blackwood was, the suffering, the secrets, the violence, pressed heavier on those who lived beneath it. Something was going to crack. The house could not hold its lies forever. The first fracture came quietly, almost imperceptible. A look held too long, a question unspoken. A night when the planter's cruelty crossed the line between domination and desperation, leaving a different kind of bruise on the soul of the house. From that moment, there was no reversing what had begun. The wife felt it in her bones. The enslaved man sensed it in the rhythm of the days. Even the birds avoided the balcony rails, as if the house itself had become unclean. The planter believed himself untouchable. He believed fear would always be enough. He never understood that when a person has nothing left to lose, their fear becomes something sharper than terror, sharper even than rage. It becomes resolve. On the night when winter surrendered to another spring, and the air carried that thick, waiting stillness before the season turns, the balance finally shifted. It began with a moment in the great hall, beneath the gaze of portraits that judged everything and understood nothing. The wife stood in the glow of a single candle. The enslaved man was near, close enough to see the exhaustion in her posture. The planter entered, full of swagger and appetite, too blind to sense the storm that had been gathering around him for years. The house watched, as it always had. But this time it would not witness in silence. What followed would be remembered only by those who survived it. The others would vanish from the record, leaving behind nothing but whispers. By the time the candle burned out, the first step toward the planter's ruin had been set in motion, and Blackwood Plantation would never again belong to the man who believed he owned the world. The spring of 1847 opened like a wound that refused to close. The days grew longer, and the sun draped itself over Blackwood Plantation in a relentless, suffocating heat. The house sat on its hill like a watchful predator, its columns glowing white against the deepening green of the fields, its windows holding secrets that refused to sleep. Beneath that roof, the rhythms of life continued as if nothing had shifted. Yet every heartbeat inside those walls carried the echo of a change that could not be undone. The planter moved through his days with a growing restlessness. Pride swelled in him, unchecked and unchallenged, though something in his eyes betrayed a man who sensed a tremor beneath his feet. He dismissed it as nerves or imagination, or the simple strain of another demanding season. He never considered that his own home had begun to turn against him. He never imagined that those who bowed their heads by force now carried thoughts he could not see. The enslaved man watched him with the same quiet intensity that had carried him through every humiliation. He moved through the fields, through the house, through the endless tasks that defined his days, yet behind his measured steps lived a sharpened purpose. The planter still barked commands, still fed his own ego on the suffering of others, but something in their balance had changed. The enslaved man no longer absorbed cruelty into himself. He studied it, traced it, understood its weaknesses. In the big house, the wife moved like a tide returning to shore after years trapped beneath ice. She opened windows that had long remained sealed. She walked corridors without shrinking into the wallpaper. She allowed her mind to breathe, even if her body was still held under the weight of vows and expectations she never chose. Each morning she stood before the mirror longer than she once dared, relearning the shape of her own face. Each night, She stared into the darkness and no longer wished to disappear into it. Blackwood had never allowed its mistress softness. Yet in those weeks she found glimmers of something resembling herself. Her voice steadied, her spine straightened. The faintest spark of defiance lived beneath her ribs, warming parts of her that had been numb for so long that feeling anything at all became a kind of rebellion. The planter remained oblivious to the shift. He believed dominion was permanent. He believed fear was an eternal currency, always taken, never refused. Yet even he began to sense that the house responded differently. Servants did not tremble as quickly. His wife did not shrink as small. His once absolute authority seemed to land on surfaces that no longer absorbed its weight. The change unnerved him, though he would never confess it, not even to himself. When night fell, the house no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a chamber echoing with things unspoken. The wife lay awake, listening to the creak of old timber. The enslaved man lay awake in the quarters, listening to the wind move through the trees. Both understood, without words, that the world they endured was nearing a breaking point. The planter sensed agitation rippling through his domain, so he tightened his fist around everything he still believed he controlled. His cruelty swelled with the heat. Punishments lengthened. Tempers shortened. Wine replaced reason and rage replaced thought. The more he strained to reassert his dominance, the more brittle it became. The enslaved man measured each outburst and counted each crack. The wife marked each escalation and waited for the moment when endurance would no longer be an option. Then came the spring storm. It rose from the horizon without warning. Thunder crouching low over the fields, wind tearing through the house with a voice that sounded almost human. Rain battered the windows and crawled through the roof beams, as if the sky itself had come to witness what Blackwood had become. The enslaved huddled in the quarters. The wife sat alone in her room, staring at a candle she could not bring herself to extinguish. The planter paced downstairs, muttering to himself, clutching a bottle that gave him more courage than wisdom. When the storm reached its peak, the house seemed to hold its breath. Lightning poured white fire across the walls, and for a moment, everything stood illuminated. The portraits, the scars in the wood, the ghost of who the wife once was, the chained strength inside the enslaved man, and the rot at the core of the planter's soul. That night marked the turning. After the storm passed, the air felt different. The fields steamed beneath the sun, but the house grew cold in its bones. The wife no longer looked at the planter with fear, only with an exhausted clarity. The enslaved man no longer looked at the planter with submission, only with understanding. And the planter, for the first time, looked out at his own land and sensed that something vast and uncontrollable was moving against him. He would never accept blame. He would never see the truth, that the downfall of Blackwood had been seeded by his own hand long before the first magnolia bloom of that deadly spring. The land remembered. The house remembered, and the living were no longer alone in their suffering. What happened next would not be stopped, not by wealth, not by law, and not by God. The days after the storm carried a hush that settled over the plantation like a veil. The earth steamed beneath the sun, but the house stood shrouded in an unease no one dared name. The enslaved returned to their labor, though they moved with a new steadiness, their eyes awakened to something unspoken. The wife walked the halls without folding herself into shadows, and each small step she took without shrinking became its own quiet revolt. The planter, however, only grew more unsettled. Control had always been his sustenance, and now, without understanding why, he sensed it slipping grain by grain through his fingers. He roamed the grounds restlessly, pushing workers harder, demanding more, punishing without reason. Yet even as his cruelty gathered force, its impact no longer sank as deeply. The fear he fed upon had begun to thin. The enslaved man, forced into proximity with him daily, moved with careful calculation, watching the planter unravel beneath the weight of a power he could no longer command. The man who once towered over every life on that land now seemed smaller, though his rage only swelled to mask it. The wife spent more time in the garden as spring deepened. She tended flowers once used only to decorate a table she never enjoyed. The soil stained her fingers, and in that simple act she felt more ownership of her life than she ever had within the rules of her marriage. For the first time in years, she could gather her breath without asking permission from the air. Rumors drifted beyond the borders of Blackwood, carried by travelers and neighboring estates. Some whispered that the planter had lost his grip. Others said the house was cursed. No one spoke too loudly. Wealth still commanded deference, and cruelty remained a tolerated language among men of status. Still, whispers are seeds, and these began to take root beyond his reach. At night the wife lay awake, staring into darkness no longer imagined as an escape, but as a beginning. She did not yet know what she hoped for, only that she could no longer bear life as it had been. She thought of the enslaved man more often, not with longing but with a sense of shared fate. Both lived under the same roof. Both bore the scars of the same tyrant. Both had outlasted countless nights they should not have survived. That made them bound in a truth deeper than propriety or position. The enslaved man, in his quarters, also lay awake. He did not dream of freedom because dreams were luxuries denied to those in chains. Instead, he thought of possibilities, of change, of what could exist once the planter's shadow no longer blotted out every horizon. He understood danger intimately. He also understood timing. A moment was approaching. He felt it in his bones the way others feel a storm before clouds form. The planter, in contrast, drowned himself in wine and arrogance, pacing his study long into each night. Portraits of ancestors watched him from the walls, stern faces, sharp eyes, men who built their fortunes on domination and believed themselves righteous for it. The planter feared becoming a failure in their gaze more than he feared God. He refused to admit that he was not losing control to rebellion, but to inevitability. He had sown violence into every corner of his life, and violence does not remain buried. It grows. One blistering afternoon, the first open fissure finally revealed itself. The planter, fueled by drink and wounded pride, inflicted a public punishment harsher than any that season. The enslaved gathered at the edge of the yard, their faces carved with silent horror as the planter raised his hand again and again on a young field worker who had faltered from exhaustion, not defiance. In summers past, the moment would have passed without consequence. Fear would have kept heads low. This time, something else took root. The enslaved man stepped forward, not recklessly but with intention. He did not challenge the planter. He simply reached out, steady and unflinching, and stopped the next strike by catching the planter's wrist. For one suspended instant, the plantation held its breath. The field fell silent. Even the cicadas seemed to halt their droning. Eyes met, master and slave, and in that gaze lived a revolt more potent than steel. The planter froze. The hand that had never been denied trembled beneath the grip of a man he deemed beneath notice. Shock moved across his face first, then disbelief, then a fury so violent it stripped him of speech. The enslaved man released the wrist without hesitation, then stepped back and lowered his gaze, not in submission, but in control. The planter, robbed of the moment he expected, stood exposed before his own domain, humiliated by the interruption of a ritual he had long believed his right. The wife witnessed the scene from the veranda. Something fierce and indescribable stirred inside her chest. Not joy, not triumph. Something deeper, something that tasted like the first breath after nearly drowning. The planter stormed away, not out of authority but out of panic. His rage no longer landed. His terror no longer ruled. His power had been tested, and for the first time, it had not been absolute. From that day forward, the balance shifted without a word spoken. The enslaved worked with a steady resolve, no longer shrinking. The wife walked through her home as though reclaiming territory once stolen from her. The planter brooded in darkened rooms, drinking earlier, shouting louder, losing himself faster. The house, once an instrument of his will, felt colder and more hollow with each passing night. Blackwood was now a battlefield, though no weapons had been drawn. It was a war of spirit, of endurance, of unraveling control. The planter did not yet realize that the moment he lost his grip on a single wrist, he also lost his grip on fate. And the spring that had always smelled of magnolia now carried the first hint of smoke. The house knew what was coming. The land knew, and those who suffered had finally begun to understand what must be done. By early summer, Blackwood Plantation lived in a state of quiet suspense. The heat settled over the land like a fever that refused to break, and the air carried a tension that everyone felt, but no one named. Work went on. Meals were served, doors opened and closed. But beneath the surface, the house and all who moved through it existed in a holding pattern, waiting for the moment when everything would shift from pressure to consequence. The wife no longer drifted as a ghost through her own home. She entered rooms without shrinking. She stood straighter, breathed deeper, and allowed her thoughts to run where they wished instead of where the planter demanded. The mirror became less of an enemy. The daylight felt less like an interrogation. She had not yet found joy, but she had found presence, and presence was its own rebellion. The enslaved man worked with a composure that unsettled those who still obeyed fear. He performed his tasks to completion, but no longer with the invisible bow that had once been driven into his spine. Others watched him, not with expectation, but with a fragile, awakening courage. A shift in one spirit can stir many, and though no word passed between them, a current of silent understanding began to move through the quarters. They had not won anything, they had not fought anything, and yet something had already changed. The planter felt it most of all, though he lacked the mind to articulate what gnawed at him. His world, once as solid as timber and iron, now felt like wet clay sliding through his grip. He still barked orders, still drank heavily, still demanded obedience, yet even he sensed that the plantation no longer breathed in rhythm with his will. When he struck, the fear he harvested came back thinner. When he threatened, the submission he expected arrived slower. His authority, once unquestioned, now echoed instead of landing. He responded as men like him always do, with escalation. He watched the enslaved man with growing obsession, circling him the way a cornered animal circles a threat it cannot understand. It infuriated him that the smallest man on the plantation had become a catalyst for his unraveling. He looked at his wife with equal suspicion, sensing that she too had slipped from his grasp. He could not conceive of a world where others possessed interior lives beyond his control, so he convinced himself they conspired against him in ways they had not spoken, not planned, but still carried in spirit. Blackwood's walls absorbed his spiraling paranoia. Servants in the house learned to step even more carefully through the hallways. The enslaved in the fields watched for signals in the sky, the wind, the smallest glance. The wife kept her silence, but silence no longer meant surrender. Silence had become strategy. As summer deepened, a drought crept across the land. Grass yellowed, ground cracked. Even the stubborn magnolia blossoms browned at the edges. The plantation, once lush and fat with profit, began to look thirsty. The planter raged against the weather, as if the sky itself had betrayed him. Each failed rain darkened his mood. Each dry day made him more volatile. One evening, as twilight spread purple over the fields, the wife stood on the second-floor balcony and watched the enslaved man cross the yard. Their eyes met only for a moment, but the look was steady. They were not allies by plan, nor partners by design, yet they had become aligned by suffering, by endurance, and by a shared understanding that the life before them could not continue unchanged. Neither knew the exact shape of what waited ahead, only that the old life had already begun to die. The planter watched them from below. That night became the seed of his final descent. In his mind, that single exchanged glance grew into a full betrayal, twisted by his ego into something unbearable. Pride, not love, was the root of his jealousy. His wife had never been a partner in his eyes, only a possession. The idea that she could hold any thought, any connection, any sympathy beyond what he permitted ignited a fury that went beyond anger and into madness. He drank until he could no longer stand without swaying. He muttered to himself in the dark, pacing the halls while servants hid and the wife locked her door. The enslaved man, aware of the shift in the air, slept lightly, if at all. The night passed without incident, but it left a residue that no morning light could clear. The following days spread tension like a stain. The planter tried to reclaim dominance with louder commands, harsher punishments, and desperate attempts to restore the fear that once ruled every breath on the land. But fear once weakened is a poor tool. He struck harder and accomplished less. He threatened more and controlled less. He demanded loyalty and found only silence. The house had turned. It no longer moved to his rhythm. It no longer absorbed his rage. Even the walls, which once echoed his authority, now seemed to recoil from his voice. Power that is rooted in cruelty can rule for a season or a year, or even a decade. But the moment its illusion cracks, it collapses faster than its wielder can comprehend. The planter did not understand that he was already living in the aftermath. Those beneath him had not risen up, not yet. They had not plotted or planned or whispered of revenge, but they no longer lived in the posture of the broken, and that alone was enough to doom him. Blackwood Plantation had entered its final season under his hand. What came next would not be thunderous or grand. It would begin quietly, in a hallway on a night without witnesses, with a single action that would make all the years before it snap under their own weight. The house waited, the land waited, and the enslaved and the wife, bound by fate not choice, waited too. The end of the planter's reign was no longer a possibility. It was an approaching certainty. The night the house finally reached its breaking point arrived without warning, quiet as a held breath. Heat clung to the walls long after sundown, and the sky hung low over the fields, swollen with a promise of rain that never came. The enslaved had retired to their quarters, exhausted from days of labor beneath a pitiless sun. The wife sat alone in her room, the shutters open to a restless wind that moved the curtains but brought no relief. Somewhere below, the planter finished another bottle and began another descent into the darkness of his own making. There are endings that come like storms, loud, violent, crashing through the world with spectacle. This was not such an ending. This one began in stillness, the kind that lingers before the moment a life changes shape. The planter's footsteps staggered down the hallway that night, carrying the weight of a man determined to reclaim something that had already slipped through his grasp. He reached his wife's door with the blind certainty of a man who believed access was the same as ownership. He did not knock. He never had. The door swung open, and he crossed the threshold with the same entitlement that governed every corner of his life. What happened inside that room did not leave marks on the furniture or scars on the floorboards, but it carved a wound into the house that would never fade. The wife endured, silent and rigid, her eyes open and unblinking as she retreated deep within herself to the only place he could not touch. She listened to the sound of her own breath and realized she no longer feared him. Something inside her had already slipped free. He could reach her body. He could not reach what she had reclaimed. When it was over, he left her where she lay, convinced he had reasserted control. He believed violation was victory. He believed dominance had returned. But as he closed the door behind him, she sat up slowly, smoothed the fabric of her nightdress, and understood with sudden clarity that the man who had ruled her life no longer possessed the power to break her. Not in fear, not in spirit, not ever again. Downstairs, the planter found the enslaved man waiting at the foot of the staircase. Not intentionally, simply crossing through the hall on an errand forced upon him by routine. Their eyes met. The planter, emboldened by wine and delusion, believed he saw insubordination where there was only witness. He stepped into the man's path, radiating the arrogance of someone who had never learned the boundaries of his own humanity. He wanted to provoke. He wanted to punish. He wanted to remind the world, one last time, that he was master. The enslaved man did not step aside, not with defiance, not with challenge. He simply stood still, rooted by a calm that came from something larger than anger. There are moments in a man's life when he knows that turning away will cost more than facing what comes. The enslaved man understood that moment had arrived. The planter raised his hand, and for the second time that year, swung with the intention of teaching a lesson through pain. But power, once broken, has no weight. His hand never landed. The enslaved man caught his wrist midair, steady and unflinching, just as he had in the yard. The gesture was quiet, controlled, without hesitation. Yet in that instant, the planter understood something he had never allowed himself to see. Fear no longer lived in the man before him. The realization sent the planter spiraling into a rage fueled not by authority, but by terror. He reached with his free hand for the pistol he kept tucked inside his coat. The enslaved man stepped back, instinct sharp, body braced. The house seemed to watch, the portraits looming in silence as a legacy of violence merged into its final act. The wife, hearing the commotion below, moved from her room and reached the top of the staircase. From her vantage, she saw the planter in his drunken fury, weapon in hand, face twisted with the desperation of a man who knew control was slipping forever. She descended the stairs slowly, yet with a steadiness she had not felt in years. The planter turned and saw her on the steps. The sight unmoored him further. He looked between the two, woman and enslaved man, and in his madness believed them united against him. He aimed the pistol, not with intention but with blind, drunken fear. The wife did not flinch. The enslaved man did not yield. The moment stretched, thin as a thread. Then fate or consequence cut it. The planter lunged, losing balance, slipping on the polished wood he had always assumed would carry him. The gun fired as he fell. The shot buried itself in the wall, far from any living target. He tumbled down the last steps, body striking the floor in a graceless collapse. The house rang with the finality of it. He did not rise again. The wife stood on the staircase, breathing steadily, not shocked, not triumphant, only still. The enslaved man stepped back, not in fear, but in acknowledgement of a moment that had ended something far larger than a single life. The planter lay motionless on the floor, undone not by rebellion nor by force, but by the same reckless cruelty that had defined his existence from beginning to end. The house exhaled. At last, Blackwood was free of its master. What remained were the living, those who had endured him, those who had survived him, and those who would now shape the land without his shadow. But freedom is never simple, and the future, though open, did not arrive without cost. The wife descended the last of the stairs. The enslaved man stood before her, steady, waiting, not for instruction, not for direction, but for truth. The reckoning had come, and the morning would demand decisions neither of them could avoid. The morning after the planter's fall arrived grey and hushed, as if the sun itself approached with caution. Dawn spread across Blackwood Plantation without ceremony, touching the fields, the quarters, and lastly the house where the body still lay at the foot of the stairs. No one rushed. No one screamed. The land, for the first time in years, felt still. The wife stood in the hallway, watching the light creep over the floorboards. Her face carried no shock, only a weary readiness. She had not slept. The enslaved man remained nearby, silent but composed, understanding that everything which came next would determine not only his fate, but hers as well. The house, stripped of its tyrant, felt different in its breathing. The walls no longer listened for footsteps. The silence no longer threatened. The wife moved first. She knelt beside the planter's lifeless form and studied him as though seeing a stranger. His features, once twisted by cruelty, seemed small in death. Not powerful, not terrifying, just a man like any other, reduced to stillness. All the fear he had manufactured, all the pain he had inflicted, all the control he believed eternal, gone. There was no triumph in her eyes, only release. The enslaved man watched her and understood the truth without words. Something had ended, but nothing was yet secure. A world built on violence did not dissolve simply because one man fell. The plantation, the town, the law, these forces still lived beyond the walls. They would ask questions. They would invent answers if none were given. And history had never favored the powerless. The wife rose to her feet and steadied herself. She did not tremble. She did not retreat into the fragile posture she once knew. She gave the enslaved man a nod, not command, not plea, but acknowledgement. They were not partners by choice or circumstance, but they now shared responsibility for what would happen next. Together, they lifted the body and carried it out the back door before the household stirred. The land behind Blackwood stretched wide and wild, in places untamed by farming. There, beneath gnarled trees whose roots had tasted secrets before, they laid him in the earth. The burial was wordless, no scripture, no weeping, no pretense of sanctity. When the soil covered him, the world did not change color and the wind did not shift, and yet everything felt altered. The wife stood over the unmarked grave and made her choice. She would tell the world he had traveled. Business in Mobile, family matters in Savannah, anything that explained absence without drawing eyes upon the house. A man of means often vanished on errands of ego. No one would find that strange, not at first. The enslaved man returned to his work with the same measured rhythm, though his steps now belonged to no master. He kept his silence, knowing survival depended not on truth but on control of the story. The quarters sensed a change but did not press for answers. They had learned that safety often lived in what remained unspoken. Within the house, the wife performed her routines with an unfamiliar steadiness. She oversaw chores, wrote letters that hinted at her husband's travels, and hosted neighbors with a practiced grace that drew no suspicion. Widowhood without proof was a peculiar burden, but she bore it with calculated calm. Her lie was not born from deceit. It was born from necessity. Weeks passed, harvest came and demanded attention. The enslaved continued their labor, but without the constant lash of a single ruler. Their suffering became a different shape, still unjust, still deeply rooted in a brutal system, yet no longer driven by one man's whims. The enslaved man at the center of this turning worked with quiet dignity. His mind, no longer caged by the planter's gaze, wandered toward futures once unimaginable. Freedom was still distant, but the horizon no longer felt sealed. The wife spent evenings on the veranda, watching the land breathe. For the first time she saw Blackwood not as a prison, but as something she might reshape, not into a monument of cruelty, but into a place where her own humanity was no longer denied. Yet she also knew the South beyond her gate had not changed with her. Danger lived in every whisper, every question, every visiting landowner who might wonder why her husband stayed gone. Peace, once unimaginable, became something fragile she had to protect. She and the enslaved man spoke little, yet their silence was no longer born from fear. It was forged from understanding. They were bound not by affection or alliance, but by survival. They had endured the worst. Now they lived in the space after, where every choice mattered and every day had to be navigated with caution. Life resumed. Crops rose. Seasons turned, but Blackwood would never again be what it once was. The house that had echoed with cruelty now held memory, consequence, and the possibility, however distant, of change. The grave behind the trees remained hidden, reclaimed by vines and silence. The planter's legacy ended in secrecy. The wife's new life began in quiet defiance. The enslaved man continued forward, eyes fixed on a horizon he was no longer afraid to imagine. The world outside remained brutal, but inside Blackwood, the shadow had lifted. And even in a place built upon suffering, the faintest shape of hope began to take root.